It's something to talk about from the Bainbridge Island Senior Community Center. We're going to garden in this frigid weather today. Fortunately, we're going to garden virtually, which means that we can talk about it. It's the Stovepipe League or something. Anyway, these programs are sponsored by Fieldstone Communities of Bainbridge Island, which offers assisted independent living and memory care up on Rolling Bay. They have a beautiful Rolling Bay campus. You can check it out. And also find out about day stay and respite care programs by emailing Ashley C. at fieldstonecommunities.com or calling 206-594-1010 or visiting the website fieldstonecommunities.com, or even just drop by and ask for a tour. Also, we begin these meetings appropriately by remembering that we are meeting on the ancestral homeland of the Puget Sound Coast Salish people. The Suquamish tribe, our neighbors to the north, have been taking care of the waters and lands in the Salish Sea area since time immemorial, and we are grateful for their hospitality and we honor them. And thank you very much for talking to us today. I know one of the things we're going to talk about is how to get ready for winter, because it's a coming.
It is. It's been frosty in the morning, if you haven't noticed. That doesn't necessarily mean it froze. You can see heavy frost before it actually gets to freezing temperatures because of the way the temperatures of the air change as they get closer to the soil. But a heavy frost like that, not necessarily killing frost, it's definitely a warning that it's time to do things like drain your hoses. And this is something that comes up every year. People are like, well, what if I need to use it? And you're like, you know what, you can put it back up for a few minutes if you need to. But really, one of the biggest issues that happens with hoses is they get left full of water and they freeze and then they split. And that can be a real issue later when you turn it on in the summer and spring and it starts spewing all over the place. And that's kind of a costly replacement these days. Hoses are not cheap anymore, especially the good ones. And I had several questions from people about how to handle soaker hoses. And the bad news is you really kind of do need to pull them out of the garden, shake them clean of whatever mulch you have on top of them. Make sure that they don't have anyone inside them. Like if you've left the end cap off, which some people do if they were connecting and then they disconnected them, the end cap is there to keep slugs out. And that little tube, that little cool, moist tube, is very attractive place for, and I can't tell you how many times in the early days when we first were learning how to run soaker hoses, people would say, it's just plugged up, something's in there. And we'd ram it out and sure enough, there'd be a whole cluster of slugs, a happy slug farm. So you want to make sure to keep those soaker hoses empty, not just of water, but of life, by saving that little cap that comes with it. And I always wire them. I put a little wire wrap around the wire, the cap itself, and then wire it to the hose end, so that if you couple them together with another one, then you haven't lost that cap. It's still going to be there. When you uncouple it, you can put the cap back on. I hope that makes sense. And here's an interesting thing. Hoses that are made out of rubber or plastic should be coiled up flat on a shelf or on the floor of the garage or shed or something like that, not hung, because when you hang them, they develop wear spots. And in the areas where they're hanging, gravity's pulling them down against the peg or whatever they're hanging on. And that's where they start to fray. And that's where you usually will find a break later on, or kink. That's where they start getting kinky. With soaker hoses, however, you can hang those up because they're really all flexible and it doesn't hurt them and they're not going to leak because they're already leaky. That's what they are, right? Leaky hoses. So that storage is
doing their job when they leak.
Right. They're supposed to leak. The other thing that I had a couple questions about this summer that I kind of forgot to mention was that several people said their soaker hoses weren't working properly. And the thing to know about soaker hoses is there are actually a couple things, but one of them is gravity works in soaker hoses just like it does everywhere else. So if you're running them up and down a hill, they're going to go down and they're not going to go back up. They're not that kind of hose. Soaker hoses will go down and just vent where the down part is. If you're going to use them on a hill, you have to go sidesy-wisey, like like you're climbing the Alps and you do the switchbacks. And that
Sidesy-wisey. That's the technical term.
It is. It's it's a horticultural term. Um, but it actually will help you. And the other thing is, if you just put a soaker hose on top of the garden, it will kind of just create a little carrot of water, not much wider than the soaker hose is. If you put a loose, airy mulch on top, whether it's, shredded bark or leaves or some straw or whatever, even a light coat of compost, then it will capillary action takes place. It pulls it out, it makes a bigger sheet, and then you really do wet the whole area in a different way. But that also means you want to get them out of there because they need to dry off properly so that they really can keep doing that and not clog.
So would you say that again slowly about how you are when you're placing soaker hoses, how you use the mulch or the
Yeah. So
humus?
some people forget to pick them up in the fall because they've got them covered with a little mulch, which is correct. You should cover them with a light, airy mulch. And it could be straw, it could be shredded leaves, it could be a little bit of light compost, or bark, coarse bark chips, wood chips, not bark chips. But when you are going to clear it, get it out of the garden, you need to dig around and find it, right? That's the piece that sometimes. So one thing you can do is always put a little stake with a little flag of some kind or twist of colored tape or something like that where the hose end is so that you can always find it even when it's not hooked up. Does that make sense? And you were asking about the mulch specifically, like how
Just
much?
you short, you were just saying that, and it kind of I wanted to get you to emphasize it just because it sounded new to me because I hadn't really thought about it. But the idea that you want, because if you just put the soaker hose out, you're just going to basically wet a strip. You're not going to
Yeah,
get the effect you want.
right. It's just it doesn't give you what you want, and that's why some people get really frustrated with them. Um, but if you're using them properly, the compost or the mulch on top helps create kind of a bubble so that it it can create a capillary action in the soil and spread out much wider. And then you really will be watering a bigger area. Does that make help?
Yes. And are there options and things we should think about? Not now, because I mean we're winding up our soaker hoses now, but in the spring, if we are like me, maybe buying my first soaker hose.
Yeah. So there are lots of different kinds of soaker hoses, and some of them are recycled rubber made of old tires and stuff. Um, Permeable hose. Those are not as flexy, so those you really do have to coil because they don't fold up the way the cloth based ones do, or woven material of various kinds. Those will collapse when they're empty, and those are the ones you can hang if you want to or put wherever you want, but you want to make sure they're empty and dry. But when you are looking for a soaker hose, you have to think about, what am I doing with this? Like, if it's going in and out of all your raspberry bushes, you want the kind that's very flexible so you can manipulate it better. If you are a straight row gardener, or you have a part of the garden that's planted in lines or whatever, then you don't really care because you can use the more rigid ones, and just lay them out. And you can usually connect quite a few of them depending on your water pressure, which around here is fairly decent. Like, you should be able to connect at least 4 hose lengths and get decent run out of that, as long as you're not trying to run, as I say, downhill and back up again, because I don't care what kind of hose you have, that's not going to work.
Thank you.
You are welcome. I wanted to show you something interesting that happened. Well, I think it's interesting. Earlier this fall, when I was transplanting some stuff and moving things around, I accidentally knocked a couple of little branches off one of my chrysanthemums. And so I'd stuck them in a vase, and they've been sitting there, and I put some pretty leaves in, and I noticed that they actually had made roots. So I wasn't really planning on that, but now I have 2 young chrysanthemum plants, right? This time of year, everybody wants to do something. And this is the time of year they're not thinking about flowers so much, most plants, and they're not really thinking about turning those flowers into fruit. They're thinking about roots. And so root time is really a good time for transplanting. It's usually a very good time for cuttings, especially hardwood cuttings or medium hardwood cuttings of things like, you know, lilacs or hydrangeas or roses that you might want to have more of, or you've got a neighbor who's got a fabulous, gorgeous hydrangea and you think, I want to get a piece of that. This is a wonderful time to do it. October, November, into even early December is the window when you'll get very good strike. As you see, I mean, my little chrysanthemums, I wasn't even asking them to do that, and they just did it on their own, right? So if you're going to take cuttings off of a bush that you've been admiring, what you want to look for is an unflowered shoot. In other words, one of the stems that hasn't got a flower on the end of it or hasn't had a flower. And those are because once they've done their flowering, their energy all summer has been going toward the flower, right? But if they haven't flowered yet, they have more of the hormones that are about growth of that branch, right? So if you take an unflowered shoot of hydrangea or rose or lilac or whatever, you will find a much better, it'll strike more likely to strike quickly and well. And what you want is something that's about the size of your finger or a pencil, say, um, not not soft, and we call it lishy. There's another horticultural term, not lishy, but not stiff and like you can't snap it, right? So it's kind of in the middle zone there of still flexible, um, but not not so soft that it's floppy. Because then if it's not that soft, it's not going to strike because it doesn't have the vascular system set up to support itself. So when you take your cuts, this is kind of funny. I actually saw a television show of a very, 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 very famous gardener doing cuttings upside down because apparently the gardening staff had actually fixed them and she didn't really recognize which end was up. But it is really important if you're doing cuttings that the lower end of the stem go down. Just saying for you heard it here first.
Keep track of where you cut it off.
Well, one way to do that is to make an angled cut, and I usually do the angled cut at the top because I want the rainwater to slide off it and not pool in any. If I cut flat, sometimes it will pool and that might be a little source of rot. But if you angle the cut at the top, then the straight cut is the bottom and you can just plunk it in. Also, you should look, and a lot of times there'll already be buds, sometimes multiple sets of buds going up that stem. And of course, the buds almost invariably are aiming up and out. So, and when you're cutting on the bush and you're looking at where the buds are aiming, like a rose bush, for instance, you think, well, next year I'm going to want the out-facing branches to still be there. So if there are some where the buds are going in, I might take the cut right there because I don't care as a cutting where the buds are going, right? But on the bush itself, I might not want that one to be throwing another branch into the middle of the shrub where I want more light and air. Is that
probably, yeah. Now this is probably not, I mean, this is the time to take a cutting off of that rose bush, but not to cut it down, not
right?
to cut it back.
Right. It's not about pruning at this time because especially with something like, well, roses are getting hardier than they used to be, but back in the day, a lot of roses were a little bit really kind of half hardy, especially the floribundas and stuff. And you didn't want to cut too much top growth off them because if there's a deep, heavy frost, as there has been the last few years, it goes down to 17 or 15, that's when you get top kill. And if you've left the top on, you can lose a bunch of the top and still have a good base. If you've cut the top off, then what you're losing is now you're talking about you're losing more of the vital part of the plant. And if it does come back, it comes back kind of slow and low. And it's going to have to put so much energy into restoring the whole base of itself that it won't have as much for blooming. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So
Yeah.
if you're cutting those chrysanthemums like you did, and then you put them in water and they started to root.
I actually just broke them. I was moving the plant and I snapped off a couple because I bumped it into something. This is when plants make their own. I've done that actually with a wheelbarrow on occasion where I rode over one of the big hardy fuchsias by accident. And the wheel of the wheelbarrow ground several pieces of the hardy fuchsia into the mud.
I'm glad real gardeners do that.
I know. And later I came back because of course I was busy doing something else. And it's like, oh, well, sorry, everybody. I came back and there was all these little lovely rooted plants. I thought, well, that's nice. So that's another thing you can do is make cuttings with your wheelbarrow if that.
So now are you going to plant this somewhere this winter?
Yeah, I will. But because they're Some of the chrysanthemums are hardier now than they used to be as well. They used to be considered annuals, really, but a lot of them have been crossbred to be tougher than they have been. But because I have a little sun porch, an unheated sun porch, I will pot them up in my sun porch and let them take their chances. And they're just a few more degrees of protection from a really cold frost. And again, I have no idea. If you look on the NOAA prediction sites, they say still 50% chance of being colder than usual, 50% chance of being warmer than usual. So
Okay, but so if I'm doing this, I've got some chrysanthemum or lilac or something, and I've got some roots that look like they're established, that I'm going to put them in some sort of soil and maybe put them next to my house or on the porch or somewhere that's protected rather than just dump them in the ground, right? Is that
yeah, and well, and here's the thing: if you're taking cuttings of a woody plant, a shrub, rather than a perennial, like chrysanthemums are perennials, right? So they don't really have branches in the same sense. But if you're taking them off a rose bush or a hydrangea or what did I say, lilac or whatever, then you want to put them into a pot with some good gardening soil that's kind of airy, not heavy. Like you don't want to dig a chunk of clay out of the backyard and shove it in. You want to actually use potting soil because new roots need air as well as water and nutrients, right? So if it's too heavy a soil, they might just rot in there. Happens a lot. But so the hardwood cuttings you want to root into, put in a pot. I actually have a pot in my front little yard right now that's got purple hazel, the purple leafed hazel shrubs in it, some different kinds of Russian sage, some different some really interesting shrubs that I have at the library that I would like to have more of that are unusual and you can't find them in the nursery trade anymore. That's the kind of stuff. And I have a big pot out there. And so there's all these little sticks basically looking like, sticking in the ground, and we'll see who wins. Generally, if I want to have cuttings of something, say I want, well, recently a friend had a really nice little hydrangea that everybody wanted a piece of, and her son had cut it back pretty hard, which hydrangea is not going to kill it. But so I just took all those pieces and I probably stuck 20 and I probably got 12. So your percentage is going to be pretty good with something like that. There are lots of plants like hydrangeas could actually root in the water just like my chrysanthemums did, but a lot of shrubs won't do water roots so much. They really want to be in some soil. But perennials is another story. And this isn't really the time to do cuttings of perennials because most of them are dying back to their crown, except for winter bloomers like hellebores. But that's a whole nother story. But all the summery and spring perennials dying back to their crown, if you want more of those, you're going to fork up the whole thing and tease it apart in chunks that have roots and some shoots. You want both roots and shoots, and break off those pieces or cut them if they seem to need that. I have a dedicated old saw that I use for cutting up big chunks of things like hostas or Siberian iris that make big, sullen, impermeable clobs. Sometimes you can have to take an axe to them, but you're not allowed to use somebody else's axe that they use for wood because it's not, if they hit rocks and things, they're never quite the same. So it's good to have dedicated destruction tools that are separate from somebody else's woodworking tools. Just saying. I see some nodding heads.
Rita is nodding as though ask me why I agree with you. My daughter won't talk to me because I used her kitchen shears. No, I don't know.
Well, yes. I mean, I've had occasions where I used to kind of just use whatever seemed like a good plan. And I used a really good kitchen knife and never heard the end of it because the knife was never the same. So I developed a whole series of like tools of destruction, which I keep separate. And it's better. It's better for family relationships.
It is. And if you're gonna buy a shovel, I'm saying the Root Slayer shovel is the best money you will ever invest for a garden tool. It cuts everything and it is awesome.
It's true.
I took your advice and I have to agree.
Yeah, you can go through gravel. I mean, that
Yes.
shovel, it's so heavy that you don't have to put as much muscle into it either. Really, gravity does a lot of the dig for you. And it has that really nice step so that when you put your foot on it, it's not just a little thin edge. It's quite a good, generous one. And you can really get some weight behind it if you need to. And then, it's long and narrow and toothed so that it really gets down into the hole and does a fantastic job.
We'll have to explain to Fieldstone that we are also going to be sponsored by these guys at Root Slayer before too long.
Right?
Exactly. That's the best thing. I bought one for my sister, bought one for me, and one for somebody else because it's just the best thing going.
They really are.
Yeah.
True story. And this time of year, when you're kind of digging stuff up, I'm always a bit careful now about, I don't want to just dig the garden randomly because of all the pollinators that are probably hibernating, but if you're going to be planting or transplanting, that shovel's nice too, because it minimizes the destruction zone because it's narrow and it doesn't just dig up a huge pit. You can make it pretty discreet, which is nice.
I have some ornamental grasses that are been overwhelmed by a peony that was much smaller when I put them all in there. This is a good time maybe to move the grasses or no? Should I wait till the spring?
Yeah, with grasses, interestingly, they generally not as good movers because they're dormant in a way that is like some grasses don't mind it so much, but a lot of the grasses don't come back very well from fall division. They're much better to divide in the spring. And similarly, some of the evergreen grasses, if you cut them hard in the winter, they rot because you give them a buzz cut and that just collects a lot of moisture that if they were allowed to have, say, a page boy bob, they wouldn't be all over your path, but they would be neat and tidy enough that you're not tripping on them, get out of the way, but they also are able to shed water the way that's what they're designed to do, right? So the grasses that are more upright tend to be better about, that's a little weird distinction, but it's true. Like a more upright grass is more tolerant of fall division, and the shapelier flowing grasses are less tolerant of fall division.
Okay, yes, you helped us with some of those tall grasses several years ago.
That's
and
right.
they're very happy there. And this I usually do cut them back just because at this point I want to enjoy them in the spring when they come up and they don't have to fight through all the dead stuff from last year.
So one thing that's kind of cool about them is that is a very common place for butterflies to leave their
back to the pollinator being aware.
Yeah. So it's something to think about. Also, those big clumping grasses, many times I have found what looks like a little bundle of dried leaves kind of crunched up like this, stuck in the bottom of that. And often I don't touch them anymore because several times I, moved one and discovered a frog, a hibernating frog. And they build themselves this little sleeping bag. And I don't think they necessarily get to do it twice. I felt really bad about that. So now if I see that distinctive looking little clump of dried leaves, I leave them alone and don't cut that back. Let it, because that's a bit of a winter shelter too, right? Also, it's kind of pretty in the winter to see those waving flags. Some of the tall grasses are still pretty beautiful.
So
If
when
you don't
can I
get
cut?
some,
I was wondering when I could cut back the epidermis.
epimedium?
Yeah, that one.
Medium.
I know, because
Epimedium.
it seems like I always kind of forget. And then, so is it in February?
Yeah. So the epimediums, some are evergreen and some are, and even the evergreen ones, you're going to want to cut those in February. And some are deciduous, and those you can cut now if you want to. I usually, because they bloom early, they bloom in January, February, March.
Right.
And the flowers get lost if you haven't trimmed the foliage. So I usually try to keep my eye on them and trim them back before that, when the flowers are just barely there. And then you can cut the foliage back carefully without cutting all the flower stems off, because otherwise, but they're beautiful. There's arching stems with these delicate flowers like little orchids, like birds on a wire. Lovely, lovely, lovely plants. So yeah, and the evergreen ones usually turn copper or reddish through the winter, or sometimes golden bronzy. And so those are the ones that I leave until later. And like I said, with the deciduous ones, if you want to cut those back, they're fine. But I do the chop and drop and leave the bits there unless they're diseased, because that's nature's nutrients, right?
exactly. So I think ours are evergreen, so I'll put it on, like, I'll put it on for like the 30th of January to remind me. I'll put it on my calendar.
Which is brilliant, Rita. That's really a good thing to do. I found so many times if I don't put it on the calendar, it comes and goes, and then all of a sudden they're blooming in the thicket, and you're like, oh, drat, I forgot, I missed them again.
I know. And that makes me mad. So I don't, so I'm gonna put it on my calendar. If it's on my calendar, I'm okay. So
Right.
that and, okay, so I want to put a witch hazel in. There is something about witch hazel. Nita and I talked about this.
Yeah.
That the winter and it comes out. So do they have like dwarf ones? Do you know? I guess I should go. I guess I could.
Do they have what ones?
Like dwarf ones?
Not super.
Because witch hazel can get pretty big, and I want to put it on my deck. I know you said that that's not a good idea.
Well,
but I want one.
I think you need a bigger deck.
Yeah.
Not
Okay.
really dwarf ones, but you
Okay.
could put one at the senior center and enjoy it there. They're going to
Okay.
be a good size, 10, 12 feet for the most
Okay.
part. And there's different kinds. Like there's native ones for the South and East of America. And there's also some from other parts of the world. And there's a number of gorgeous hybrids that are bigger blossoms, and they are so fragrant. I just love them. There's a kind with purple foliage that I have at the library. And there's some with pink flowers and yellow flowers and white flowers, but they're subtle, they're small, they're not big bloomer, they're not like a camellia. They're
right, no, exactly.
Elegant, pretty little things.
But they're so nice in January if they're blooming and they just say hi to you when you're taking a walk.
What you might do better with was winter jasmine, which has yellow starry flowers. And that's a shrub too, and that's a spreading shrub, but there are smaller forms of that. And you could have it in a pot for a few years, divide it,
right,
periodically to keep it small. But that'll make a fan kind of really beautiful emerald dark green stems, and then these delicate spangle of golden flowers.
okay,
Jasmine.
That we'll get some of that.
Yeah, Carolina jasmine, it's called.
Okay.
Is it like the same kind of place as witch hazel, kind of a sunny spot, or?
Well, witch hazel actually is a edge of the woods kind of plant, so it's going to do better with like morning light and afternoon shade, like so many things like that. The Confederate jasmine usually does fine with more sun, more direct sun. It's not an understory plant. It's more of a take whatever it can. And there's some really pretty hybrids of that too, which, but the thing to think about is wind. If you're in a very windy exposed place, then that's going to get creamed.
Okay.
So
I'll put it at the senior center then and come down and visit them.
For an exposed windy balcony, I think you'd do better with hellebores.
Oh yeah. Okay.
Because they're pretty reliable, and because they're evergreen, or some of them anyway, the ones that that you would probably want, they and pretty structural, and they really do tolerate being in a pot, for a good sized pot, for quite a long time. That's going to be a plant that's pretty tolerant of the conditions. Then in the summer, that's when they might not be so happy, and they would want to be in a little shadier spot, or you might have some plants that you circulate, right?
Exactly. Okay. Thanks.
You're welcome. I did have some questions about bulbs. Somebody asked, how late can I plant them? And the answer is you can actually plant them whenever you find them, but what might happen is they won't bloom on our schedule. They'll bloom on their schedule. So if if you don't plant the tulips till February, look for them in June. But if you do remember to plant them sometime in the winter, you'll probably see them, April, May, because they're doing their best. And bulbs, unless they're stored damp and they're getting moldy or rotten, or they actually freeze, they're going to be fine. And they already have the flower. The flower is already formed fully in that bulb, which is kind of cool, right? They're going to bloom unless you have done something that they can't get over.
Yeah.
So it doesn't really matter so much. And one thing that's fun to do if you have a small space or a balcony is to have a fairly deep pot and layer the bigger bulbs So, and I usually mix in some charcoal with a deeper pot to make sure the soil stays sweet all the way down. But you'd put your bigger bulbs, like maybe those wonderful fritillaries, big, tall, checkered fritillaries that are like 4 feet tall. You might want 3 of those. And then maybe you want some flowering onions. So you put those in there too. And some earlier tulips, little ones that are going to come up, or even, handful of crocus. And all those things can coexist in a pot as long as once everybody's done blooming, they get a chance to dry out. Because the one thing that's really hard for bulbs is that if they stay wet, if that soil stays wet all summer, when they're sleeping, that's when they tend to rot. So there's another one that you would have to circulate. Like once the great flower show is over, then you want to put that pot out of range. Like maybe you take it, next to the house at the north side or something, somewhere where it can be sleepy and not be expected to perform. Sometimes what I'll do with those is put a shallow bowl on top of them, which will cut off the water and let them dry out completely. Now you want to be sure you don't have a bunch of slugs or something in there though, so that you're making a happy place for them. But once that, the bulbs have all died back and you collect all the dried foliage off it, you put a little compost on top and put a shallow bowl on top and have that be a color bowl for the summer.
Oh.
Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
And then the bigger one becomes like the base.
Okay. Good. Thanks.
Yeah. Anita, do you have any questions?
Yes, I have a couple little fuchsias that I forget what variety. I'm sure you'd recognize. They're more toward the miniatures, and I had them on my balcony for attracting hummingbirds. Well, I brought them over to my new apartment, and I see they're losing leaves. Should I be giving them some attention, or should I just let them stay till spring? What should I do?
Well, yeah, most of fuchsias are going to be deciduous, so they're going to be losing their leaves.
Okay.
A lot of them will bloom, well into autumn if they're happy, and well fed. But this isn't a good time to give them fertilizer because you don't want to encourage new growth in something like that. But one thing that's cool about hardy fuchsias is you can bury them deeper than you would. Like you can do like a tomato. Like if they're buried deeply, they'll make more roots and they will be less susceptible to frost damage. Now, you can't do that with everything, right? Some things will choke if they're planted too deeply. But hardy fuchsias, you can plant really deeply. So if you're feeling like they're more exposed where they are now, or if they're getting more wind or whatever, like in Rita's situation, then you can plant them deeply, put good light mulch on top, and then they'll get through the winter really nicely.
Are you saying repot them? Because they're in pots. So I should repot them in a bigger pot?
Well, if they're in a very small pot, yeah. I mean, generally speaking, plants in pots need to have refreshed soil. So
Yeah.
if they're really going dormant, then you can repot them anytime you want to. If they're still flowering, I would wait because they don't want to do 2 things at once. Let them be done with their flowers and be dormant, and then you can pot them up again. Otherwise, they're trying to make new roots, get used to a new place, and still put out flowers, and that's a lot to ask. But just losing the leaves is probably just, they're adapting to it's probably a different light aspect than it was in your other apartment, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Is there anything, I'm trying to, entice hummingbirds. There's anything like plant-wise to put out before spring that might?
In the fall and early winter, weirdly enough, that pineapple sage often blooms really late. And
yeah.
That's one the hummingbirds just love. It has red flowers, and that does pretty well in a pot as long as the pot is a good size. It can't really perform because it's going to be 3-4 feet high or more. It needs a good volume of soil to support it. But yeah, that's a good late bloomer for. And then the other one, of course, is any of the Mahonias or Oregon grape clan. And there are some of those pretty ones like Soft Caress, I think it's called, that has almost palm tree like foliage, very soft and ferny. And then it sends the familial spikes of those very fragrant yellow bell blossoms. And the hummingbirds love those.
What was the variety again?
I think it's called Soft Caress, and there's another one called Tender Touch or something. It's a whole series of hybrid Oregon grapes.
Okay.
So Mahonia something, um, and they're crosses, pretty complex crosses, but they're nice, and those are evergreen. So of course their foliage is going to be nice. Rita, you could have those.
Oh,
Um,
good.
yeah, and they're lovely. And that's when I have hummingbirds every day on mine, and
Okay.
through the winter until if they're all get pollinated, the flowers fall off, right? And then you got to start with something else. But there's not really it just so depends on the year. We don't know what the weather's going to be like. But traditionally, and I used to make what we called a tussie mussy at Christmas time, and there would always be a rosebud and some calendulas and a little schizostylus and some all kinds of bits and pieces of stuff, some carryovers that were late bloomers, maybe chrysanthemums, right? Um, and then a few tiny, like early things, maybe. But every year it would be different because you just never knew who was going to get hammered, right? Or who was going to make it through until you start doing your little gleaning and gathering. And, you'd make this beautiful little bouquet and it would give the illusion that your garden looked like that. Well, it didn't. It was like a whole bush and there's one flower at the back, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah, you have to kind of try things out. One thing I always used to say is like, if you go nursery shopping in January and something looks good in January, that is a good plant.
Mm.
So that's something you can, bring home and know that it's going to look really nice. Sometimes in a limited situation, like with balconies, you might just know that you're going to be friends with this plant for a few years. It's going to outgrow you. You'll have to bring it to the senior center and plant it out in the back garden and start again with something different. Right?
Yes.
That's okay. It's like, going to the thrift shop and choosing out a wonderful new sweater for yourself, right?
Yeah.
Trade plants.
You can always come and visit your plant.
Yes.
Exactly. Water it and weed it.
And then calendulas are really reliable.
Oh, yeah.
And they really are. That's why they're called calendula means calendar flower, because they bloom in really every month of the year to some extent. And because you can keep them going, when you see an older bloomed out plant that's just kind of losing it, you can cut it back pretty hard, but also look for younger plants, and maybe those are going to be the ones that are going to rise up and bloom through the winter for you.
Right.
Okay. Well, are we ready to go gardening?
Yeah, well, that's the other thing to think about. It's like it's pretty cold. And so I would really encourage you to think about like when you're going to be outside for any length of time. Rita was saying she was gardening this morning, and as long as you're moving around, you're fine.
Right.
But thinking about like layering your clothes and making sure your hands and feet. When I used to work as a professional gardener, most of the time, all of us would carry extra socks in the car or the truck. And at lunch break, you'd take off, stop, and change your socks and put on a fresh pair of gloves, dry, right? Keep your feet dry. I recently dragged out my old Wellington boots that I hadn't really worn for a while because I hadn't had a garden for a few years, and remembered how comfortable they are in the wintertime. They're awesome. You can put really heavy wool socks on and keep your feet warm and dry in Wellingtons. So you don't have to be waiting to use those nice heavy boots, right? And having a good supply of gloves, making sure you always have some gloves. And they do wear out. Like it's always a big surprise to me when my finger comes through the end. And you're like, oh, these are only they're only 3. Well, no, 5. Well, actually, maybe 8 years. Okay, never mind. It might be time, right? So it's treat yourself to a fresh pair of gloves every now and then. I love those insulated Ace ones that are they're kind of rubberized on the fingers, so they're a little bit more waterproof, but they still breathe out the back, and those are great for winter working. And this is really a good time to start looking at the weeds of winter always start germinating as the rains of autumn wake them up. So you think, oh, it's all winding down. Well, some things are winding down, but what's winding up is all those eager beaver weeds, right? So looking around and seeing who's getting it frisky and who you might want to take care of early so you don't have a big problem later. And again, that's where loose, airy mulch is your good friend. And I always like to use shredded leaves or just plain old leaves if you have a deep, big border, and you can put them all at the back, rake them off the lawn if you have to, and put them all at the back of the border and let them molder down and take care of, keep feeding that soil for you. And then if they get blowy, you can put a layer of shredded wood chips on top, and that will anchor them and they won't blow all over the place. And it will all kind of rot down gently and make a beautiful new soil for next year, right? And this is a good time to start thinking about hardy annuals like the calendulas we talked about. But there's quite a few native annuals like the limnanthes, what's called sometimes fried egg flower, little white with golden centers, or the baby blue eyes is another really beautiful little native annual. And this is a great time to sow seeds of those. The only thing you really, what I try to do is put a little 4-inch pot there with a few of the seeds in it and put a piece of that blue painter tape on the pot and write on what it is. Because if I see a whole bunch of little green things popping up somewhere and I'm not sure what they are, in the years past, I've often weeded them out and then suddenly thought, oh, that could have been. So if you have a little pot as you're like, this is my sample, if they look like this, I should leave them there, right? That kind of gives you a living example of what you're actually looking for and what you want. This is really good if you're starting to do a pollinator patch and you're not sure what you all have in there and you don't know what the babies look like. It's a great way to try to train your eye of like, and if you're not sure, take pictures over a week or two. And then after a while, you'll be like, oh, that looks a lot like a thistle. It's probably not. Now, if you have thistles, the goldfinches will love you, but you also might have more thistles than you really want before too long. So you start to learn what's the balance point of keeping this pollinator patch not too wild, but wild enough to be good habitat, but not so wild that I have thistles everywhere, because that can be not the most pleasant weeding experience, for one thing.
So Anne, if I've got some of the, I got some of the little frutilla.
For Larry.
Yeah, those. I have a bunch here at the Adventure House in a pot. And so I just love them. And so I collected a bunch of the seeds about a month ago and I've got them. So can I start those in small pots?
You can.
Now.
Unfortunately.
And I've got that nice window I got with a wide windowsill so I could put them inside.
No, put them outside, but be aware that fritillaries can take 6 or 7 years before they're big enough to bloom, and they look like grass when they're babies. So,
right. Oh, okay.
They come up and they just look like little grass shoots. So
I know, but I got a whole pot I've got a whole pot at the Adventure House, so maybe I should come and when they start coming up is dig some of those up and put them in a pot.
Absolutely. And I talk about, like, when you have a balcony or you have a limited space, one of the coolest things you can do is maybe you have a very large pot with a central plant in it. Like I have a large pot with a winter blooming Yuletide camellia, which has single red flowers with really thick gold fringe at the heart. And I just love them so much. And so that's my centerpiece plant as that grows up. But underneath it, you can have all kinds of other things. But because you have a center plant that doesn't take kindly to root disturbance, what I do in those situations is drop a few empty pots in and leave them there, and they're placeholders. And so, it is kind of funny because when I used to do it, they were all round pots because a lot of times the color plants of seasonal color came in round pots. Well, then they all started coming in square pots. My center pots were round. I was like, dang. So I just saved a bunch and I would buy the new little thing in a 4-inch pot and then just transfer it into the round or whatever, whatever it is. But those can stay. And maybe it's the baby daffodils that are so charming, right? Or maybe it's some wonderful tumble of the golden leafed, yam, right? Some pretty things like that are sort of seasonal, but you don't have to rip them out and disturb and dig. You just plunk them in and out of their hold it spots. And that way you can have a lot of change in color and interest in your small space, and just enjoy them. And, again, when they're done, you can come plant them someplace like at the senior center.
Exactly.
Is,
But it's
is
fun.
it,
I mean, that's just a fun way to kind of have life and change in a small space without, and making sure that your centerpiece plant doesn't get beat up a little because, root disturbance doesn't make them happy.
yeah.
Right. So could I put a lemon cypress on my deck, or would it be too windy, do you think?
No, I think you would do fine. Like Wilma, one of those very tall, narrow ones.
Yes.
Yeah. So be aware. Okay. So they're beautiful as puppies, but a
Right.
lot of them are grown. They're not all clones from the original, and they don't all stay true. So
Right.
if it starts getting fatter and wider, it's not going to last. But you should get anyway 3 to 5 years out of it, and maybe more.
Right.
And
Right.
and if the pot is big enough, and then at some point again you're going to have to shift. But by then maybe you
Right.
want something else anyway, right?
Right. Exactly. Okay.
And I was going to ask you if this is a good time to plant some herbs. If some of the, like, I don't know, thyme or sages or.
Yeah, not really. I mean, it's well, the one that you can plant anytime you want to is oregano or mint.
And I don't want
Caution,
mint.
because it's gonna eat your
You
yard.
want some mint? I have some mint.
Yeah,
No, thank you.
I got some mint for you. But the oregano moves really pretty well. But a lot of like the hardy Mediterranean herbs really don't necessarily like our wet, cold winters.
Hmm.
And especially if you're in a situation now, if you have a big pot, you want to just make sure that pot doesn't freeze, because some of them, they're not all frost hardy in a pot. They might be frost hardy in the ground. But if the pot freezes, which it would do before the soil freezes, because it's a smaller volume and it's more vulnerable, that might not work so well. But if the plant also, interesting, like a planted pot will probably not freeze and break if
Right.
there are roots that are infiltrating that soil. But sometimes a new pot that has new soil and a small plant in it, it's like it can trap moisture and it might shatter in the cold, where the more mature potted plant would not. I hope, does that make sense?
Yeah.
So, I would say for the more anything that is borderline tender, like thyme especially, is really sensitive to being wet, mucky wet.
Mhm.
And woolly thyme especially does not like to have that. So maybe wait on those and do that in March, April.
Well, and Anita's deck is, mine is opened with the wires, and hers is closed in halfway up with wood. So she has a much more protected deck than I do.
So that might mean, yeah, so you might be able to do that. What I would say is, like, be sure that any pots you have are in saucers, and the saucers are up off that wooden deck, with a like 2 pieces of wood, say, or make a little triangle of short pieces of wood, because you can get enough moisture under the saucer that will rot the wood.
Mm.
Ask me how I know this. Air circulation is really important, but if you do have more protected sites, yeah, you might be able to get away with some of those somewhat more tender things.
Yeah.
Well, did we miss anything? I'm trying to think what we were going to talk about. I think we've covered most of it.
Well, we have to put some little daffodils or something in, or those little, what comes up first? Those little what are
Snow
those?
crocus. I love them. So snow crocus multiply like crazy. If you ever go to the library in the late winter, you will see sheets of them in some areas. And it's so funny because years ago I put in maybe 100, but they seed themselves around and they spread by they bulblets too. And so every time we moved a plant or we picked up all the waste and put it in the compost and then we put it back around, we were putting the seeds of those snow crocus everywhere. And they are just all over the place now, which is really fun. So snow crocus are going to be the first ones up, and they don't need deep planting at all, really shallow. And you can have them indoors in a pot and then move them out into the garden and they'll proliferate out there just great. They don't do super well in turf, but they do beautifully in pots. And then they need the summer rest, like I was talking about earlier. So I have like a whole pot of early blooming things, they spend the summer in the shade in the dry area where they don't get rained on and they don't get any moisture, right? So you can
So-
overwinter over summer them that way and have those in the, but you can also kind of figure that for $5 you can get a new pot of baby daffodils or whatever each spring
Right.
and be fine with that.
Right.
Is that the same as snowdrops? What we call
No,
snowdrops?
no.
No?
So snowdrops, so crocus are, they have a narrow tapering base and then they have a cup shaped flower, right?
Mhm. Like the purple.
Snowdrops are going to be dangling from a curvy stem.
Right.
They do hang like bells. And if you turn them and look into them, they're usually white or creamy or pale yellow greeny. And inside they'll have little green markings, different kinds of darling, but they all have this hanging, they hang from little tapers. And snowdrops will proliferate too, but they take their time.
Oh,
They
Yeah.
will get spread very nicely, but they also need to dry out in the summertime, or they will often rot, especially in our heavier soils. And then there's snowflakes, which are different again, leucogyne, and they are tall, and they are also kind of on a bendy stem, but whereas snowdrops are going to be a few inches tall, the snowflakes can be a foot or 18 inches even, and much bigger, curving, much bigger bells. We've got big patches of them at the library if you ever just take a look.
yeah.
What's
Is that
gorgeous right
popped into
now is
my memory? Gallianthus? Is that
galanthus.
galanthus? Is that a white? Is that kind of in that family
Yeah,
similar?
those are the little snowdrops.
Oh,
right. Yeah. I was going to say what's gorgeous right now at the library, if you go by, is the beautyberry. This is having such a year with the purple
Yeah.
berries, and there's just heaps of it this year. It's so funny. Some years it doesn't. The flowers are so small that they're almost invisible. They're just teeny, and they're pollinated by teeny wasps, and certain kinds of smaller bees. And you never even see them until all of a sudden in the fall, these pinhead sized purple berries just all over the place. 1 year only, a whole bunch of thrushes came and just stripped that plant overnight. But most years they don't eat them at all, which is so interesting to me. So, yeah, this is a
Yeah.
very good beautyberry year, and that's
Yeah.
you
I got to see them.
Well.
I never saw one so beautiful.
Yeah.
It was- yeah.
Yeah, I saw them last week when I took a walk, and I saw those in the back and I go, ooh, those are just fabulous.
They're stunning. They're
Yeah.
so beautiful. So yeah. Anything else?
I
Well,
don't
I want
think,
to thank you, Anne, as usual. This has been delightful, and we've got we know what to do, and then almost as importantly, what not to do.
Right. And remember, no matter what happens to your plants, there's, they never go to college. It's not like a crime if some of them don't make it all the way through, right?
Well, I'm taking great heart from the wheelbarrow pruning guidance. So
yeah. Yeah.
Exactly.